We're going to move into the first session now. I'm going to be chairing this session, and our first speaker is Katie Evans. Katie is the Research Analytics Librarian at the University of Bath and previously worked in the university's open access team. She is an advocate for good practice in research evaluation, conducts bibliometric analysis on behalf of the university, and equips researchers there to understand and use publication and citation indicators. So really looking forward to Katie's talk here. Would you like to take it away, Katie? Thank you very much.
And good morning, everyone, or perhaps good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Bear with me a moment while I share my screen and get the slides set up. Okay, right, so it's gone on. Hopefully you're now seeing, does that work, the slides showing? Super, thanks. So
yep,
research
great.
Evaluation and information literacy. Just to say a bit about where I'm coming from. I'm part of the Library Research Services team at the University of Bath with the Scholarly Communications team. We're an inside-out library service working on opening up, promoting and preserving the university's research. I look after our research evaluation service, research analytics service, and this is all about trying to enhance the profile of the university's published research. And I've put some of the strands of our service on the slide here, and all of these strands involve evaluating research in one way or another, or at least trying to evaluate research. So that might be backward looking at past performance to see if we can understand, for example, how the university is performing in the World University Rankings, or supporting a researcher to present the strengths of their publishing track record within a grant application. But research evaluation can also be forward-looking. So we might be, again, supporting researchers with their publishing strategy. We're trying to decide where the best place to target to publish is, or profiling possible collaborators to build the university's partnerships. But what has this got to do with information literacy? So I'm going to try and come at this from a couple of angles this morning. I want to start by talking about how important it is that we apply the skills and principles of information literacy to research evaluation. And that will lead us into thinking about the wider picture of scholarly communications and the changes that we're seeing in scholarly communications. And then I'm going to flip things around and just briefly look the other way and see, can we apply some of the tools and techniques that from the world of research evaluation, can we apply those to information literacy, particularly to literature searching? And then to finish with a couple of ideas about where there might be scope for collaboration between information literacy specialists and research evaluation specialists. So starting with applying information literacy to research evaluation. Research quality is notoriously difficult to pin down. It's multifaceted and nuanced, and every piece of research is different. It's a bit like having beautiful artworks and being asked to evaluate them. And I work a lot with publications data, with citation data and various metrics based on citations. And I often think that trying to express or trying to give an indication of research quality in terms of these metrics is a bit like taking a silhouette. We start with this beautiful iris painting and represent it something like this. It's very flat and monochrome. It can never give us the full picture. The metrics, the indicators never give us the full picture of research quality, but you can still see the relationship. Although I have to admit, given the limitations of lots of the data and the metrics that we work with, it might be more like starting with this beautiful painting and then representing it as something like this. You know, we know it was a flower, but a lot's been lost in the process. Now, sometimes this process of distilling down to distill out a few key indicators, a few key aspects of research performance, research quality can be really helpful because it gives you a handle on something that was otherwise a bit too complicated to pin down. But there are, of course, risks with this process. And the big risk is that in this process of distillation, bias can creep into our evaluations. And there are lots of ways that bias can creep in. I think the one that we can see most clearly is just in terms of what's counted. A lot of the work I do starts with data from a citation database like Web of Science or Scopus. And we know that these databases focus on English language publishing, and particularly when it comes to the citation data within those databases, really it's still focused around journal publishing. So everything else is pretty much invisible in a lot of the work I do, and that's a clear bias in our assessments. But even if your research is comprehensively covered by the citation databases that we're using, there can still be bias in the indicators that come out of our research assessment processes. And that's because even before we start doing an assessment, there are inequalities and bias within the research environment, within our wider society, and those will then be reflected in the indicators that we use. So to give a recent example, with the COVID pandemic this year, when we went into lockdown in the spring, quite quickly academic publishers were reporting that they'd seen a substantial drop in submissions of publications coming from women, and much more so than they had seen a drop in submissions coming from men. And this was the pandemic having an unequal impact along gender lines. And although that's one quite extreme example, that inequality isn't new. Those inequalities are already there within our environment. And so if that affects the access people have to the time and resources that they need to conduct research, that will then have an impact on their research productivity in terms of publishing, and then that has an impact on their citations and so on. So these biases will be reflected in the numbers. Although it has to say that sometimes using quantitative indicators can be a way to take bias out of the process. You can imagine that if you represent say a research or a body of research with a scorecard of different indicators, you don't need to give personal characteristics on that scorecard. You don't need to give the person's name and gender and so on. And so that can be a way to remove an opportunity for bias to creep in. But unfortunately, they say that the bias is there in the system already, and our numbers will reflect that. And as if that isn't enough, there's also the potential for the approach we take to research evaluation to introduce more biases into our evaluations. The image on the slide here comes from a very useful briefing paper put together by Dora, a short briefing paper they've done on cognitive and systems biases and how those operate within research evaluation. So for example, you get things like the halo effect, whereby if a researcher is associated with a prestigious institution, that will predispose an assessor to think well of their research. Or the Matthew effect, where resources, in this case, citations, tend to accrue to people who already have a lot. So if somebody's already a highly cited researcher, it's easier for them to get more citations than it is for somebody starting from scratch to get the same number of citations. So you can see that trying to evaluate research is fraught with difficulties. And this is where information literacy comes in. So I have here the CILIP Information Literacy Group recent definition of information literacy as the ability to think critically and make balanced judgments about any information we find and use. And this is exactly what we need when we're trying to evaluate research. We need to think critically and make balanced judgments. Jane, in her introduction, mentioned Lizzie Gadd, who's Research Policy Manager at Loughborough University and a real advocate for improving research evaluation practices. And at the Liverpool event, Lizzie suggested we might coin this term research evaluation literacy. So you can see she's adapted the CILIP Information Literacy Group information literacy definition and tailored that to research evaluation. So research evaluation literacy would be the ability to think critically and make balanced judgments about the use and interpretation of research indicators and assessment approaches. And this is an area where there's been quite a lot of conversation in recent years. People are already starting to take notice of this. And often this conversation gathers under the heading of responsible metrics or responsible use of metrics. I've put a couple of quotes on the slide there from a couple of key documents in this area. We have the Leiden Manifesto and the Metric Tide. These are both about 5 years old now. But you can see here what's really coming through, this need for critical thinking, for making balanced judgments. And I should also mention DORA, the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment, which started as a grassroots movement from the life sciences community, campaigning against inappropriate use of journal impact factors in assessments of research and researchers, and has grown now into a wider advocacy movement, campaigning for good practice in research evaluation. One of the ways that universities have been engaging with this conversation about research evaluation and how we bring those information literacy skills and principles into research evaluation has been by developing their own policies or own statements of principles about how they approach research assessment and how they're trying to do this well and fairly. So this is the Universities of Bath's statement of principles about our approach to research assessment and management, which we published in 2017, I think. So we're asking that any form of research assessment that goes on within the University of Bath should adhere to these principles. And you can see our first principle, it needs to be centered on expert judgment. So this is us trying to bring some of those information literacy skills and principles explicitly into our research assessment practices. So this is an area that's getting more attention, and we're seeing real commitment to trying to do research assessment responsibly and fairly. But it has to be said that putting this into practice is quite challenging. So this brings me on to the second topic I wanted to talk about, which is linking this into the conversations around wider changes in scholarly communications. So far, I've come at this from the point of view of having a need to evaluate research for a particular task. So we might need to benchmark and compare some universities, or we might need to decide from a pool of applicants for funding for research who should be given that funding. But how we do research evaluation has much wider ramifications. It has wider implications for research generally and for scholarly communications in particular. So for our generation, the major change in scholarly communications that we're living through is the transition to open access publishing and to open scholarship practices more generally. And we've been working on this for what, 10 years, 20 years now? And there's a broad consensus in the research community that this is desirable, that we want these open practices, we want open scholarly communications. And so you start to think, well, why is this so hard? You know, why aren't we there yet? And I think quite a few people have been asking this recently. The report on the slide here is just one example. It's a European Commission report from 2019 about the future of scholarly communications and looking at, well, what does it take to get us to the future that we want, to the open scholarship practices that we want. And the conclusion that this report comes to, and other conversations coming to similar conclusions, they're identifying research evaluation as a key to this changes that we want to see in the scholarly communications. So our current research evaluation practices unintentionally hinder the transition to open access and open scholarship. And so people are saying if we want to change scholarly communications, then we need to change our approach to research evaluation. So to try and unpack this a bit, why do we need to change how we do research evaluation? We've already talked about the biases that can be present in research evaluation. And you can see that these have real implications for the researchers who are being assessed. And we owe it to the researchers to be assessing them as fairly as we can. And this is exacerbated by the really competitive nature of academia. I've worked in university libraries for about 15 years now, but I didn't realise until I moved into this research analytics role just how competitive academia is. There were some very, I thought, enlightening statistics quoted in a Nature editorial a couple of years ago. They said that 3/4 of doctoral researchers are intending to go on to pursue an academic career. But if you look at figures for the UK, only 3 or 4% of PhD students from the UK go on to become permanent members of university staff. And the Nature editorial said that this is comparable to the level of competitiveness you see in people trying to pursue a career in professional football. So we don't think of being an academic as being as competitive as being a professional footballer, but apparently it is. And so often what this boils down to is a lot of pressure on researchers to be publishing in prestigious, high-impact journals, because the perception is that when it comes to assessments of research, really that's what counts. People are looking to see where you've published, have you published in the prestigious high-impact journals, and that is what's rewarded in terms of allocation of resources for research, in terms of job opportunities, promotion opportunities. And so this real concentration and pressure around publishing in prestigious high-impact journals, it builds a sort of inherent conservatism into scholarly communications. It means that our researchers can't really take a risk on new open access publishers or on innovative ways of sharing their research findings, because the perception is that that would be risky in terms of then their sort of future opportunities, how they're going to be looked at when their research is evaluated. And that means that it puts quite a lot of power into the hands of the publishers of those established prestigious high impact journals, because the research community can't just walk away from them. So if those publishers want to drag their feet about open access, well, they can. And similarly, with what we call the serials crisis, the ever increasing costs of subscribing to and now also of publishing in these prestigious high impact journals, the importance attached to publishing in those journals in our research evaluation practices means that, say, we can't just walk away from them as a research community. And so that, again, puts the power in the publisher's hands when it comes to negotiating the costs of those resources. And similarly, the perception that it's your publishing, and particularly your publishing in high impact journals, that's what's looked at in research evaluation practices. That means that there's a perception that other things like peer review, data curation and sharing your research in ways that have societal impact are less rewarded somehow. And in this very sort of competitive, time pressured environment, that means that they can fall down the priority list. So we can see then this unintended, but nevertheless there, consequences of how we currently do research evaluation and how that's hindering the changes in scholarly communications that we've been working towards. And there are even more these unintended negative side effects of our research evaluation practices for research more generally. So for example, a replication study or a study that's found negative results that hasn't found the results it wanted to, they're unlikely to be published in a prestigious high impact journal. So this pressure for publishing in those venues is contributing to the reproducibility crisis in science and to the selective publishing, to leaving gaps in the publication record. And some people say that this is also incentivizing a sort of sensationalism, that people are under pressure to get the sort of sexy research results to publish in these high impact journals, and that sometimes comes at the cost of the robustness and rigor of the research involved. So you can see then that this need to bring information literacy skills of critical thinking, of making balanced judgments into our research evaluation practices has wider implications. It's not just for the fair assessment of the research for that particular evaluation exercise, but also these wider consequences for changing scholarly communications and for building the research environment that we want to have. So that's the sort of the big picture stuff. I'm stepping back from that for a moment and trying to look at this from the other direction. Are there ways that we can apply some of the tools and techniques that are usually used in the world of research evaluation to information literacy tasks like literature searching? And I've got just a couple of examples I'd like to share. So example is around visualizing search results and using these visualizations to then develop and hone your search strategy. So in the example on the slide here, what I did is I started by searching the Scopus database for publications that matched the key term Quaker. And then I've used a free tool called VOSviewer to visualize the search results. And what VOSviewer has done is it goes through the publications that I've found, and it picks out from the titles and abstracts keywords and key phrases from those publications. And then it represents those key terms in this network map. So the idea here is that each dot, each bubble on the map is a key term. The bigger the bubble, the more publications have that key term in it. And then the bubbles are positioned on the map so that key terms that often occur together in the same document are closer together and joined by the lines on the map. And so this gives us a sort of subject mapping of the literature that we found. And the VOSviewer has clustered this for us. So you've got different coloured clusters. I realise this image is probably too small for you to read from the slides. So this is another representation of the same network map, but it's focusing on some of the key terms that came up most often. So as I said, I started by searching for the key term Quakers. Now, Quakers are a religious group, and we can see in this top blue cluster on the slide here, we've got key terms around theology and worship. Then in the red cluster at the bottom of the slide, the key terms we see here are related more to Quaker history. There are key names and places from Quaker history. So you can see those two sort of distinct subsets within our search results, but both with a clear relation to our original search query. The green cluster, when I looked at this, it's a bit harder to intuitively understand what the relationship between these words and our original search is. And what's really interesting, if you look down the edge of this green cluster, we find a couple of things. So firstly, we find Quaker oats. Now, Quaker oats are nothing to do with Quakers as a religious group. And secondly, we find this bird, Mipsota muncus. I don't really know how to pronounce it, but this is the Quaker parrot. Again, nothing to do with Quakers as a religious group. So you can see how this is giving us ideas about how we might want to refine our search strategy. For example, we might want to exclude the keyword oats. Or if you were particularly interested in the theological aspect of this or the historical approach, you might want to pick out keywords from the blue cluster or the red cluster to add to your search strategy to refine your search. So that's one way that these visualizations, the profiling of research, can be helpful for literature searching. But suppose it was the Quaker parrots that we were interested in, these parakeets. We've seen that keyword searching can be a bit hit and miss. So this is a different approach where we're using citation networks to map the literature and using that as a way into finding the literature on a topic of interest for us. So this example comes from Scopus from their topics feature. So what Elsevier have done is they've done a huge network analysis of all the publications in the Scopus database, looking at the citation links between them. And they've clustered those together into clusters of publications, maybe a couple of thousand publications in a cluster, which are all closely linked by citation relationships. And the idea is that these clusters would share a common focused intellectual interest. They might represent publishing around a particular research question. So this gives us a very organic and nuanced way of mapping the research literature. And Elsevier are presenting these as the topic feature in their product SciVal. So if you can find a topic that matches the area that you're interested in, then we can analyze this in different ways or pick out different characteristics from it that might be helpful for literature searching. So for example, here we can see the researchers who are most frequently contributing publications to this topic area. And we can also see the journals which are most frequently publishing publications from this topic area. And those might both be useful ways into exploring the literature. You might want to follow up on a couple of key researchers from the area or set up current awareness alerts from some of the key journals. giving us a different approach to literature searching.
Katie, just a five-minute reminder here.
Thank you, Mick.
Thank you.
Super. Yeah, so that brings me on to the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is about where might there be scope for collaboration between research evaluation specialists and information literacy specialists. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is that we can team up on the training that we provide for researchers, particularly around these areas of literature searching and publishing strategy. A lot of the concepts that we use in both literature searching and in talking to researchers about their publishing strategy, it's the same concepts, although just coming at them from different angles. So there can be quite fruitful overlap between the two there. I collaborated, for example, with the education subject librarian at the University of Bath. We were invited to do a session, particularly for staff in the education department. And that invitation came initially as an invitation to support that department with thinking about their publishing strategy. But when we started to talk to the academic who had invited us to do that training, we realized that actually there was a real interest in the information literature, the searching strategy side of things as well. And that became a very, it worked well together as a training session. The second area where I think there might be scope for collaboration is around bridging the skills gap in, so for libraries, research evaluation is really quite a new area for us. And it's an area where sometimes people lack confidence, particularly if you're in a role where this is one aspect of your job, but you can't devote all of your time to it. You've got other responsibilities as well. So a couple of years ago, the LIS Bibliometrics group commissioned some research to put together a framework for bibliometric competencies, setting out what the core and more advanced competencies for working in this field are. And the idea was that institutions would be able to use that, for example, if they were putting together job specifications to create roles in this area. But you can also use it as a sort of self-assessment exercise to see where you have gaps in your own knowledge and confidence. And Dr. Karen Rowlett at the University of Reading used these bibliometric competencies as the basis, first of all, for a survey for her liaison librarian and colleagues, and then based on the results of that survey, she put together a custom in-house training program to sort of boost the skills and confidence of the liaison librarians in this area. So there's another possibility for collaboration. And the third example I have here is one where I think the information literacy community are probably have the head start on this, which is around decolonizing scholarly communications. I know that information literacy specialists have been very involved in the conversations in recent years around decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing the library. But if you think about that first example I gave about how bias comes into our research assessment methodology, just around what gets counted in our citation databases, you can see, I think, why we might need to be thinking about decolonizing scholarly communications as well. And I'm sure there will be other opportunities for collaboration. I'm hoping to get more ideas about that this morning. So thank you. I hope that came across okay. I keep having signs popping up on my computer saying poor internet connection. So I hope I'm still with you. And if we have any time for comments or questions, do that.
Thank you very much, Katie. It was really interesting. And I didn't experience any minimal quality at my end, so it all seemed to be working okay, which is brilliant. So we've had a few questions coming in. One of the first questions that came in was, when you provide bibliometric reports to faculties, do you include information about the potential biases so that they are aware of them?
So I always make sure that we're very clear about where the data has come from. And if I'm aware, if it's for somebody in an area where I'm aware of coverage issues, then we will highlight that. And the statement of principles that I put up, the University of Bath statement of principles, I reference those as much as possible. Any report I give, any presentation I give usually has a reference to those there. So we are trying to give that context. Yes.
Yeah, and in my own experience of that, I think some of the products are getting slightly better at sort of building things like that into the reporting part, like in SciVal, for example. It has improved slightly.
That's encouraging.
Another question that we got through was how did the development of the principles of research assessment and management begin? I don't know if you can answer that one. Who supported it? What were the roadblocks? That sort of thing. Yeah.
So I'm based in the UK, in England, where we have the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, the National Assessment of Research that happens every sort of 5 or 10 years. And the last iteration of that, back in 2014, there was a independent review group set up by the body who undertake that exercise, looking at the role that metrics and indicators can play in research assessment. And their report, the Metric Tide report, was one of the key documents I mentioned in these conversations around responsible metrics and research evaluation literacy. And one of the recommendations in that document was that institutions should have their own statements of principles about what they wanted to do in research evaluation, rather than being driven by external assessments like the World University Rankings. And so we picked up on that recommendation and used that as an impetus to say to our university we should do something about this. And we were very fortunate to have high-level support from our Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, who has sort of championed this and chaired the working group that made our principles and is still the sort of reference person for those principles. So having that high-level support within the institution has been really helpful for getting a statement of principles set up and running.
Thank you. We've had a few comments as well about your use of the VOS viewer. People were wondering if it's freely available, and it is. It's quite an interesting tool, a different way of looking at things. And I think there's a link to the where you can download it on your slide, isn't there? So
yes, and in a moment I'll find it and put it in the chat as well.
Yeah, yeah. And another positive comment about your use of searching, Lauren. I'm not sure where Lauren is from, but she was running something like this, but way less organized just the other day for the beginnings of a systematic review as a health librarian, and she'd love to get your advice and suggestions about that.
The person who I've seen doing this really well was a speaker at a CILIP event a couple of years ago, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I'll find the link and put it in the chat again, because that was somebody coming particularly from the systematic review community and looking at sort of data mining and really more advanced techniques for honing search strategies for that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Katie. We've had a couple more questions, but we don't really have time to ask those at the moment. So thanks again. I'm going to move on to